I am Deacon Terry Loader from the town of Summerside, Bay of Islands, and I serve as Deacon in charge of the parish of Cox's Cove and McIvers. Justice. We call upon the federal government to establish a written policy that reaffirms the independence of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to investigate crimes in which the government has its own interest as a potential or real party in civil litigation. 26. We call upon the federal, provincial, and territorial governments to review and amend their respective statutes of limitations to ensure that they conform to the principle that governments and other entities cannot rely on limitation defenses to defend legal actions of historical abuse brought by Aboriginal people. We call upon the Federal Law Societies of Canada to ensure that lawyers review appropriate cultural competency training, which includes the history and legacy of residential schools, United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. We call upon law schools in Canada to require all law students to take a course in Aboriginal people and the law, which includes the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. 29. We call upon the parties, and in particular the federal government, to work collaboratively with plaintiffs not included in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement to have disputed legal issues determined explicitly on an agreed set of facts. 30. We call upon federal, provincial, and territorial governments to commit to eliminating the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in custody over the next decade, and to issue detailed annual reports that monitor and evaluate progress in doing so. We call upon the federal, provincial, and territorial governments to provide sufficient and stable funding to implement and evaluate community sanctions that will provide realistic alternatives to imprisonment for Aboriginal offenders and respond to the underlying causes of offending. We call upon the federal government to amend the criminal code to allow trial judges, upon giving reasons to depart from mandatory minimum sentences and restrictions on the use of conditional sentences.